Today's programme begins in my home country, London to be precise, at Westminster Abbey. Where are buried England's great? Well, not everyone quite made it into the Abbey, so they were buried in St Margaret's Chapel nearby. That's where David is now to begin our programme on the winged bulls of Assyria.
Layard's epitaph is really unique. I just love it. It's so arresting. I pray you, remember Henry Austin Layard, the discoverer of Nineveh. Well, he did discover Nineveh, but actually that's not what his ambition in life was. You see, his father was a member of Parliament and a very prominent member of the gentry here in England. And that was really Layard's ambition, to make his way in life in Parliament, in politics. And he did very well. Ultimately, he did become well, in fact, if fate had treated him kinder, he would have become the Prime Minister of England. I think he was too honest to be a successful politician, but he did become one of the ministers of government here, Under Secretary for Foreign Affairs. He did become the British ambassador in Madrid and the very important post of the British ambassador in Constantinople, which was right at the heart of the empire in those days, you know, a key to the empire. And so Layard was a very important person. But how did he get into archaeology? It was really all by chance. He received an invitation to go to Ceylon, Colombo, as a barrister in his uncle's firm, because he was trained to be a barrister, and so he set off to go to Ceylon. But in those days, you either went by walking or you went by ship. Now, the normal thing to do was go by ship, but it so happened that Layard had a friend called Edward Mitford, a man 10 years his senior, and he also was under appointment to Ceylon. And so they decided to travel together. Now, the only problem was Mitford was a very bad sailor. He just got seasick at the slightest provocation. And so he just couldn't face the journey by sea. There was no alternative. I mean, in those days, there was no British Airways or Qantas, and so the only alternative was to go by land. Well, they set out, and they travelled overland, first of all, by riverboat, ferry steamer, and stagecoach. But by the time they reached Yugoslavia, Dalmatia as it was then called, the public transport system petered out. It sometimes does that, you know. And so from then on, they had to go by horseback. Now, Layard had never ridden a horse in his life, but when you've got 13,000 kilometres to go, you pretty soon learn. And so they started out by horseback. Actually, these two men were not compatible. They were different natures, they had different interests, but so they had a few problems. But anyway, they reached Constantinople, and that's where Layard became very, very sick. And he went along to a doctor there who leeched him. Do you know what leeching means? He marked out an area on his stomach to put leeches on to suck the bad blood out. And I think Layard survived in spite of the treatment, not because of it. Anyway, he recovered, and then they went down to the Holy Land. At last, the two intrepid travellers reached Jerusalem, and this must have been a very satisfying experience for Layard. Not that he was a particularly pious young man, but he was very knowledgeable in Bible history, and so he was very delighted to come here. But this did not satisfy him. He wanted to go on to Petra. Now, in those days, Petra was a very dangerous place. John Burckhardt, the Swiss explorer, had only just discovered it in the year 1812, and even when I went there for the first time, I had to hire an armed guard to look after us while we were in Petra. So in those days it was dangerous, and Mitford would have nothing to do with it. And so Layard had to go down there by himself, leave Mitford in Jerusalem. Well, he nearly did lose his life. He certainly lost some of his property. But he visited Petra, got back here, and in the meantime, Mitford had taken off, couldn't wait. And so Layard had to follow him to Damascus. When he got there, Mitford had already left, and so he followed him on to Aleppo, and there he caught up with him. And the two travelled on until they reached Mosul on the Tigris River. When Layard and his companion reached Mosul in northern Iraq, Layard saw for the first time those mounds over the other side of the Tigris River that were to play such an important part in his later life. He couldn't help speculating, what are they? What is buried underneath there? He also met Texier. Remember Texier? He was the man who first noticed the Hittite capital. And they had a lot of talk together, you know, about the mounds, these tells that have buried cities underneath. They even went over to the tell and scratched around on the surface, picked up some pieces of pottery and other things. But of course Layard had to go on his way, so he and his companion got on a raft and floated down the river Tigris. Quite an adventure in those days, because there was always the stray Arab who would take a pot shot at them with a rifle. Fortunately they weren't very good marksmen. At night times they had to camp on the side of the river, on the bank of the river, had to light fires around them to keep the lions away. There were lions there in those days. And as they floated down, Layard noticed another mound. It was the old city of Nimrud, and there was an old ziggurat there. And again, Layard's mouth watered to know what's underneath those mounds. He was later to find out. They got down to Baghdad, and there they spent the next 3 months learning the Persian language, because the next leg of their tour would take them through Persia. When they were ready, and Layard was brilliant at languages, he soon picked that up, and away they went. They got to Hamadan, and that's where the parting of the ways came. Layard wanted to take the southern route, but that of course was the dangerous route. His companion preferred the safety of the northern route. They couldn't agree, so they parted company. I don't know whether Layard's companion ever reached Ceylon or not. I do know that Layard didn't. He travelled south and got involved with the Bakhtiari tribe in their revolt against the Persian government, and he was there for 2 years. But he was on the losing side. Eventually the Bakhtiari capitulated, and Layard had to hot-foot it back to Baghdad. Well, while he was there, the British government asked him to take some papers to Constantinople. It was rather an interesting diplomatic situation, and the superpowers were struggling for the supremacy. Layard agreed, and so he took these papers back to Constantinople. On the way, he passed through Mosul. And once again, he looked longingly at those mounds, and he met there the French consul, Paul-Émile Botta. Now remember, Layard could speak French very fluently. They got on very well, and they talked about these mounds. Anyway, Layard went on to Constantinople, and there he was introduced to the British ambassador, Sir Stratford Canning. And Canning took a liking to the young man, offered him a job on the embassy staff, and Layard stayed there for 2 years. It was while he was there that he received a letter from Botta, who'd started excavating at Khorsabad. And in this letter he said, "Come, let us have some archaeological fun at Khorsabad." Oh, Layard would like to have joined him, but he was not able to leave his job. But he did work on the ambassador and said, "Look, the French are stealing a march on us here. We should be getting some of these things out of the ground." And at last Canning said, all right, I'll give you some money, but be careful. We don't want any diplomatic incidents, you understand? So away Layard went to Mosul. He didn't announce that he was going to do any digging. That would arouse suspicion. What he did was purchase some shovels and some picks and some rifles, and announce that he was going to go pig hunting. Well, any Arab could appreciate that idea, and away he went down there to Nimrud. So Layard commenced his excavations at Nimrud, and he had some very exciting experiences and made some wonderful discoveries too. He unearthed some spectacular winged bulls and cuneiform inscriptions from the palace of what we now know to be Ashurnasirpal II. Probably the most spectacular discovery he made was a great big large black obelisk. Now at the time it was not known how to read the cuneiform inscriptions, but just at the right time Henry Rawlinson started work on the Behistun rock, and at Bisitun he made copies of the wonderful inscription of Darius the Great. It was a trilingual in 3 different languages. Well, by working on the Persian, with which Rawlinson was very familiar, he was able to work back to the others, and so he was able to decipher it, and he wanted to put it to the test. So he got together with Layard and they looked at this monument, and would you believe it? This monument turned out to be Shalmaneser III, and bowing down in front of him was Jehu, a king of Israel. Now this was the first time an Israelite king's name had ever been found outside of the Bible in a monument. And so here was King Jehu kneeling down prostrate in front of Shalmaneser III. Well, this created big news back in London, of course, because the world was more Bible orientated in those days, so this made the headlines, and Layard worked on there with good success. After 2 years he went back to England, and he was a very popular speaker. He lectured all over the place, and after a year he returned to Mosul. This time he was able to excavate at Nineveh, and he worked there for another 2 years. Sent a lot of winged bulls and a lot of inscriptions and monuments back to the British Museum, and the public were very excited. He had already written a book called Nineveh and Its Remains, but he made a mistake, you see. Nineveh was so effectively buried and lost that nobody knew where it was. And so he thought he had found Nineveh when actually he'd found the biblical Calah. Botar also at Khorsabad thought he had found Nineveh, but he hadn't. And so at the end of these 2 years, Layard returned to England, and that was the end of his archaeological career. He then went into politics, and he became very successful. Well, the history of Assyria is one of tyranny and cruelty. That's the way they ruled. And from the time of Ashurnasirpal II down to the time of Ashurbanipal, there was just a whole series of cruel campaigns. It was in the year 722 BC that the Assyrians came here to the city of Samaria. Actually, they started the siege 2 years earlier, and they surrounded this city and besieged it for 2 years. And at the end of that time, the Israelites were conquered. This city wall was broken into, and the Assyrians poured in, and the Israelites suffered the cruelty of the conqueror. The Assyrians marched them off into exile and sent most of them to the land of Assyria. And then they brought a whole lot of Assyrians here to occupy the country. And so we have what are known as the Samaritans, who are a mixture of Israelites and Assyrians. In the year 701 BC, the Assyrian king Sennacherib invaded Judah and laid siege to Lachish. Now you see that mound over there? Well, the city of Lachish was built on top of that mound, or as we call it, a tell. It was here then that one of the great dramas of history took place. Now we have 3 sources of information to tell us about the drama that took place here. The first is in the biblical account, in the 2nd book of Chronicles, and in chapter 32, where we read here, "After this, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, sent his servants to Jerusalem.
But he himself and all the forces with him laid siege against Lachish. Now, personally, I can't stand here and just look here and see stones and a hill. I see people. I see the Assyrian army surrounding here, the officers conferring with one another. How are we going to attack this city? Where's its weakest point? And so I can see the drama taking place. Now, the second source of information is from the archaeological excavations. And they are able to tell us that this city had a very powerful wall built right around the perimeter of it, and over there was a very strongly fortified gateway. And so we know that this must have been a very well fortified city. The third source is from a relief known as the Lachish relief, which is today in the British Museum. It comes from Nineveh, and it shows the action, and we can reconstruct the whole thing from that. We see the Assyrian forces building a ramp up there, and then we see them dragging their battering rams up there to hammer down the walls. And then we see them bringing up the scaling ladders, men climbing up the ladders, and at last they drop inside the city and storm the inside of the gate, open the gate and allow all the other soldiers to swarm in there. And very soon this whole city is conquered and the terrified inhabitants have to yield to these invading forces. And then comes the terrible cruelty. The Assyrians were very cruel people. They ruled and dominated by their savage cruelties. For instance, we see reliefs of them beheading the captives. We see them right in this city, throwing the bodies over the wall. You see them falling down. And they impaled their victims, put a pole up in the ground with a sharp end, and then sat a fellow on top and just dragged him down onto it. Terrible. Or they thrust the pole up through under the ribs and pushed it up under the heart and lungs. And then, just for variety, a fellow would hold a captive by the hair and cut his skin in strips and peel it off. And then, of course, we have the final scene of the captives being led away into exile. Up there in Jerusalem, King Hezekiah heard of the siege of Lachish. He also received a delegation which brought him a defiant ultimatum demanding his surrender. And knowing of the cruelty of the Assyrians, he didn't want to be a victim himself. And so he said, yes, yes, I'll surrender. I'll read it to you from the second book of Kings, chapter 18 and in verse 13, where it says, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. Then Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have done wrong. Turn away from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will pay. And the king of Assyria assessed Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. At that time Hezekiah stripped the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the pillars which Hezekiah, king of Judah, had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. Well, here is the biblical record. Now, a very interesting confirmation of this comes from Assyria itself. I have in my hand here an exact replica of the cuneiform record that Sennacherib left of his invasion of Judah and his siege of Jerusalem. The scribe who wrote this was a real master. The cuneiform writing is so clear and it's beautifully done. And just so that everyone would know about this, Sennacherib had 3 copies made. One is in the Hebrew Museum, one is in the British Museum, and one is in the Chicago Museum. Now, this record that Sennacherib left wonderfully confirms the biblical record. Let me read a translation of it to you. Part of it, anyway. It says, as to Hezekiah the Jew, he did not submit to my yoke. I laid siege to 46 of his strong cities. Now that, of course, would include Lachish, and conquered them. Himself I made a prisoner in Jerusalem, his royal residence, like a bird in a cage. Now that's significant. He doesn't claim that he conquered Jerusalem. He simply says he shut up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, admitting, in other words, that his siege did not result in the conquest of the city. Hezekiah himself, whom the terror-inspiring splendour of my lordship had overwhelmed, did send me later to Nineveh, my lordly city, together with 30 talents of gold, 800 talents of silver, precious stones, all kinds of valuable treasures, his own daughters, concubines, male and female musicians, and so on. He mentions all that was sent. Well, that just confirms what the biblical record says. Now, mind you, there is a slight difference, you'll notice. In 2 Kings chapter 18 and in verse 14 it says, "And the king of Assyria assessed Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold." Now, there's a slight discrepancy, but I would simply say that Sennacherib was inflating his figures a little to make them look better. Soon after this humiliating surrender by Hezekiah, tragedy struck. He became very sick, and the prophet Isaiah came to him with the comforting message, "Set your house in order, you're going to die." Well, Hezekiah didn't particularly like the idea of dying, and so he did some hard praying. And would you believe it, before Isaiah had got to the other side of the temple court, he was given another message, came back and said, "God says, I have added 15 years to your life." And Hezekiah got better. It was a real miracle. Well, his faith was strengthened by this miracle. He knew Sennacherib would come back, and so he decided to make some preparations. We read about it in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 32 and in verse 5. "And he strengthened himself, built up all the wall that was broken, raised it up to the towers, built another wall outside, and made weapons and shields in abundance." You see, he just didn't sit back and say, "Oh, well, God works miracles, he'll look after us." Yeah, he believed God would look after him, but he did what he could to cooperate. He also says, this same Hezekiah also stopped the water outlet of Upper Gihon and brought the water by tunnel to the west side of the city of David. Now, this is the spring Gihon here. And so what he did was to dig a tunnel from here through to the other side of the city so that the Assyrians would not be able to find water, and so that he would have an abundant supply of water in the city. And so this is a remarkable tunnel. We're going to go through it. So far, we have been coming through the tunnel that has been made by the Jebusites. Now, that was before King David conquered this place. And they had this tunnel going through here, and at the end there was a shaft going upwards so that the women could let their water pots down and collect the water. But from here on is Hezekiah's tunnel, and this goes for 500 metres through the solid rock. The workmen who dug this tunnel began from both ends. Now, the ones who started from this end were using their picks this way. Can you see the pick marks? And the ones from the other end, of course, were going that way. I'll point that out later. But here are the ones where the workmen were working along this way, you see? The inscription that was left at the end of the tunnel tells how they started from both ends, and in the middle they heard themselves calling to each other. And so they changed direction, they were close to each other, and they joined up. Now, here is where the people coming from the end we have come turned the corner to meet up with the others. Now, this is where the workmen were coming from the other end, and they reached this point. They went a little further. This tunnel goes a little further here, you see. And it was then that they heard the hammering in that direction, and that's when they changed direction and went over there and joined up with the workmen from the first end we came from. Now you can see the pick marks where the men coming from this end were using their picks down this way. Do you see the pick marks sloping that way? And so here were the workmen coming from this end, moving in that direction. Now we are near the exit of this tunnel at the Pool of Siloam, and just here there was an inscription in the ancient Hebrew writing. Well, nobody knew it was here until some boys were playing in the tunnel and they noticed the inscription and reported it. And so a Greek merchant, thinking he'd make a little bit of fast money, came down here and chiseled it out. He had no clues as to how to do it, and he broke it into many different pieces, but anyway he got it out. But the authorities caught up with him and they sent the inscription off to the Istanbul Museum, or Constantinople it was then called. I'd like to read you a translation of this inscription. This was the manner of the piercing through. While yet the diggers were lifting up the pick, each towards his fellow, and while yet there were 3 cubits to be cut through, each heard the voice of one calling to his fellow, for there was a crack in the rock on the south. And on the day of the piercing through, the diggers struck pick against pick, one over against the other, and there flowed the water from the source of the pool, 1,200 cubits. So Hezekiah had made his preparations, and when the Assyrian army turned up and surrounded the city with all their cruel intentions, his faith didn't waver, and God honoured his faith. It says here in 2 Kings chapter 19 and verse 35, it came to pass on a certain night that the angel of the Lord went out and killed in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed. Right here, I am in part of the old city of Jerusalem, the Jerusalem of David, Solomon, and Hezekiah. And in fact, you can see behind me some gaping holes which could very easily be the tombs of David and Solomon, or what remains of them. Actually, there's been some quarrying going on here, and so a lot of the stone has been taken away. But here, in this old city of David, Solomon, and Hezekiah, the prophets of Israel lived, and subsequent to Hezekiah's time, they began to predict the downfall and doom of Assyria and Nineveh. Were you aware that there are 2 entire books in the Bible devoted to Nineveh? Well, just in case you don't, I'll tell you what they were. There was the book, for instance, of Nahum. It starts off this way. The burden against Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum. You see, this whole book is about Nineveh. And it says in verse 14, the Lord has given a command concerning you. Your name shall be perpetuated no longer. I will dig your grave, for you are vile. So this verse said that God was going to bury Nineveh. And that's exactly what happened. In the year 612, Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, cooperating with Cyaxares, the king of the Medes, made a frontal attack on Nineveh and conquered it. They put it to the flames and destroyed it. Now, usually when a city in ancient times was destroyed, they simply built on top of it. Not Nineveh. It was never rebuilt. You know that 200 years later, nobody knew where Nineveh was? And when Layard started looking for it, and he started digging up Calah or Nimrud, he thought he'd found Nineveh. That's how completely Nineveh was lost. And so, exactly as the prophecy said, Nineveh was destroyed and buried. Now there's another very significant prophecy, and this one is in the book of Zephaniah. In chapter 2 and in verse 13 it says, God will stretch out his hand against the north, destroy Assyria and make Nineveh a desolation, and the herds or flocks shall lie down in her midst. Now concerning Babylon, it was to be said that no shepherd would make their sheep lie down in the ruins of Babylon. But here it specifically said Nineveh's ruins would be a place where the shepherds would lead their sheep. You know, when I first went to Nineveh, I thought to myself, now, I would like to be able to find a flock of sheep there, you know, relative to this prophecy. I needn't have worried. Do you know, all over the mountains of Nineveh, shepherds lead their sheep. You can see them today. Lots of flocks of sheep and their shepherds, just exactly as the biblical prophet said. Now, the message I get from these fulfilled prophecies is this, that if these particular prophecies are so specifically and accurately fulfilled, we can trust the rest of the biblical prophecies too. In fact, Zephaniah has a message for us today. He draws a lesson from this very experience of Nineveh. Want me to read it to you? Listen, it says here in chapter 2, or verse 14 of chapter 1 first, "The great day of the Lord is near. It is near and hastens quickly. Just as surely as Nineveh met its doom, so, Zephaniah said, this whole world is one day going to meet its doom." And what is his message for us? "Seek the Lord, all you meek of the earth who have upheld his justice. Seek righteousness, seek humility. It may be that you will be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger."
It's a good, peaceful feeling to know that no matter what the future holds, God will take care of it for us if we let him. Now, what do you know about Babylon, the Golden City? That's what we discuss in our next program, the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had, which reveals dramatic events soon to happen in our world.